So this may well be the most important video I've made to date, because there's one thing that most of you are doing every single day in the name of healing that is completely sabotaging all your efforts, and you need to stop. So here's that thing. You need to stop allowing yourself time to process your emotions. And the air quotes are key here, because what you're actually doing is more harmful than you know. And I know that everyone's not going to want to hear what I have to say in this video, but I've been doing this a long time, and I can confidently say that most of you need to hear it. And this isn't just my opinion. We'll get to some supporting evidence soon. My name is Christina, and I help people heal from the patterns these relationships leave behind. And if you're not sure where you are in your healing right now, I've put together a free quiz that can help give you some clarity. There's a link to that below. So now let's talk about what you're really doing when you think you're processing. Let's talk about those air quotes. So let's say something happens in the course of your day and it makes you feel some big feelings. So maybe it brings up some big grief or betrayal, and you feel like you have no choice but to honor that feeling and to sit with it. So far, so good, right? So there you are feeling the big emotion, and there your mind is, reinforcing why you feel that way. Your mind is exploring the problem from all angles and recounting all the past pain you've experienced. And you get so wrapped up in the story that your mind is weaving that you've forgotten all about honoring the actual emotion. And if you stopped listening to your mind for just a moment and started listening to your body, you'd realize that as far as your body is concerned, you're sitting there fighting for your life. But then let's zoom out of this picture, and here we see you sitting on your couch. There's no one screaming in your face or threatening to leave you. You're doing all of this to yourself. So the knot you feel in your stomach and the heart racing, all of that that's going on physiologically is happening as a result of what's going on here. And all of this beating yourself up is often done in the name of processing your emotions or processing your feelings. But really what you're doing is deepening those feelings. And there's also a name for it, and it's called rumination. And it's doing so much more harm than good. So one meta-analysis found that rumination doesn't just keep the negative emotions alive, it actually amplifies them. So it's linked to higher rates of depression, anxiety, and even PTSD symptoms. And now let's zoom in for a second on what's happening in your brain when you ruminate, because this part actually blew my mind. In 2020, researchers looked at the brain scans from hundreds of people who were asked to ruminate. And here's what they found. The same part of the brain that lights up when you're thinking about yourself, your past, or your story, something called the default mode network, lights up like a Christmas tree when you're ruminating. And there's no surprise there, right? Because rumination is very self-focused. But this part of your brain is called the default mode network because it's kind of like your brain's home screen. It kicks in when you're daydreaming, remembering things, or imagining the future. And it's not a bad thing on its own. But here's the problem. When you ruminate, that network gets stuck on repeat. It keeps pulling you back into yourself, back into the story, and back into everything that went wrong. And so here's where it gets dangerous. That same network is also hyperactive in people who are depressed. So the more you ruminate, the more you're strengthening the same brain circuits we know are overactive in depression. So think of all this ruminating like a path in the woods. Every time you ruminate, you are walking that same path. And the more you walk it, the deeper the trail gets, until eventually it's the only path your brain knows how to take. And that's why it feels so hard to think your way out, because your brain has literally built a shortcut back to the pain. So when I say you're doing more harm than good, I am not exaggerating. Your body is reliving the event. It's firing like you're under attack. And by continuing to ruminate, you're teaching your brain to wire the pain deeper. So we've established that rumination is not the same as processing your emotions. And rumination is probably a whole lot worse for you than you realized. But before we even get to how to actually process your emotions, we need to talk about how to stop ruminating, because the two are not the same thing. You're typically not going to be able to swap rumination out for actual processing because the pull you're feeling towards those thoughts is way too strong, especially if you've been walking that trail for decades. And there's no shame in that either. Every single client I've ever worked with has struggled with rumination at some level. And so it's the very first thing we usually tackle together. And I'll usually ask what they're doing to avoid the inevitable overthinking, because we all know it's problematic to some degree. And the people who are most successful at keeping the rumination at bay have two things in common. One, they're relying on distraction to keep the problematic thoughts to a minimum. And two, they're usually a little embarrassed to admit that. Like it means they're doing this whole healing thing wrong. And I actually get that because we're taught that we can't run from our feelings, which is absolutely true. But giving your mind permission to distract you from the narrative loop that's keeping you stuck is not running from your feelings. It's just giving yourself permission to step off that trail for a little while. And once you've given yourself enough space from those thoughts, you'll be able to do some actual healthy processing. But it's true that if you stop here and only rely on the distraction to solve the problem, you're absolutely bypassing your feelings. But it is okay to distract yourself from the onslaught of negativity that your mind is drawn to, especially in the most painful moments. Because make no mistake about it, distraction is better than rumination, always. Distraction creates a space between you and the story that would otherwise keep replaying in your head. And of course, this isn't the only way you can give yourself space from problematic thought loops. But for some people, especially in those early days, it's the most effective. And I've also found a combination of strategies are important here because one thing isn't going to work 100% of the time. But once you find something that does work and you can give yourself some breathing room, you can start actually healing. And this is where the actual processing comes in. And to understand this, I want you to picture a washing machine. When you're actually processing your emotions, it's like running a load of laundry. You put the clothes in and you let the cycle run, and then it's done. But rumination is like leaving the clothes in a spin cycle, just spinning around and around. It feels active, right? Because you can hear the machine working and the drum is moving. It's actually moving very quickly. But nothing is actually getting cleaner. And the more you leave it, the more tangled and worn out everything gets. And that's exactly what happens when you sit down for a big cry or you open your journal and instead of moving through the emotion, you just keep spinning the story. So you don't come out feeling lighter. You come out feeling wrung out. And that's why you can have endless ugly cry sessions and fill stacks of journals and still don't feel like you're any closer to healing because you weren't processing. You were spinning out. So it's not that journaling or crying are bad. Those things can be helpful tools in your recovery, as long as you're not getting lost in the story behind them. Instead, try validating the emotion without judgment and give it space to exist. And here's where the science behind this gets interesting. So research on trauma survivors has shown that the people who ruminated the most after an assault were the ones with the slowest recovery. Their PTSD symptoms didn't fade. They actually stuck around longer and hit harder. Another study found that rumination doesn't just trap you emotionally, it messes with your ability to problem solve. So when your brain is busy rehashing the same story, you literally can't think as clearly or flexibly. And that's why it feels like the harder you think, the less progress you make. And I also find this incredibly interesting because we often fool ourselves into thinking that we are problem solving when we rehearse future arguments or scenarios in our head. We think somehow we're preparing ourselves to deal with the pain or frustration. But this study shows that we might be doing the opposite. So, what if we stop trying to think our way out of trauma and start feeling instead? I know it sounds scary, but I've got some hopeful news for you. Neuroscientist Jill Bolt-Taylor points out that the raw physiological surge of an emotion in the body lasts about 90 seconds. After that, it's usually our thoughts that keep the feeling alive. And so this is hopeful news, right? That without the story, maybe that bad feeling would only stick around for about a minute and a half, right? But I also want to be clear that one 90-second processing session isn't going to magically change your life. You know, just like laundry, you have to do it regularly. But every time you run into one of these thoughts that could take you into rumination, instead of spinning in it, you're teaching your brain and body that emotions can move through. And that's the habit that will heal you. And now I want to share a handy way to tell whether you're processing or ruminating in the moment, because the line is not always black and white, and rumination can also be very seductive. It can really draw us in. And it's easy to convince yourself you're doing something healthy when quite the opposite is true. So here's what you need to know. Processing is not about the why. It's about the what. What's happening in my body right now? What does sadness feel like in my chest? What does anger do to my heart rate? When you let the body feel the feelings, so maybe the tightness, the heaviness, or even the tears, you can look at that kind of like the wash cycle. The emotion rises, it peaks, and then it passes, at least for the moment. Like I said, this is not a one and done kind of thing. This is more like a habit that will eventually help you heal. But in contrast to that, rumination is very much about the why questions that don't have answers. So why did this happen to me? Why didn't they care about my feelings? Why would they do something like this? And the ever popular, why were they so okay to move on so quickly? These are the kind of questions that start that spin cycle. They're just gonna wear you down. And of course, you can't control which thoughts randomly pop into your head, but you can control which thoughts to follow. So if you're noticing a rumination thought, don't judge it or yourself. Just gently shift it into a processing thought instead whenever you can. It will serve you so much better. So this is the reframe I want to leave you with. You cannot think your way out of trauma. You can never spin yourself into healing, but you can build the habit of actually processing over and over as many times as your feelings need until your body feels safe to release them. And that's what real healing looks like. And before we wrap up, I want you to hear this. None of this is your fault. If you've been stuck in rumination, it doesn't mean you're weak or doing healing wrong. It means your brain and body are doing exactly what they were wired to do after trauma. Replay the story in an attempt to keep you safe. The problem is, the very thing your brain thinks is protecting you is actually keeping you stuck. That's why breaking out of rumination feels so hard. You're not fighting laziness or lack of willpower. You're literally working against brain pathways that trauma carved in very, very deep. So please don't beat yourself up for being caught in this cycle. What's happening inside of you is completely normal. And this is the important part, it can be changed. If you want to understand more about what's happening in your brain during the trauma bond, for example, which I know a lot of you are dealing with, and why none of any of this is really your fault, I've linked to a video right here that dives into the neuroscience behind it. And I think it'll give you a lot of clarity and maybe even some compassion for yourself. So go ahead and give that a watch. And before you go, be sure to hit the like button, and I'll see you again next time.